Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to sew a French dart or a cutaway dart. So it's a dart that doesn't have any bulk in the middle. It's going to be two seam allowances that we're going to be sewing together to create a dart. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how I would sew it, how you should finish it in terms of pressing, and also tips for overlocking or serging your end results. If you're more interested in what a French dart is, then please watch my specific tutorial where I share some examples of a French dart, what it is and where you would find it on a garment. I will also be covering a how to draft a French dart tutorial very soon, so stay tuned. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you feel more confident when it comes to sewing French darts or cutaway darts in the future. They really are lovely, flattering darts on patterns, so hopefully you will have lost your fear for them and now be confident in working with them. Now the first step is obviously to cut out your fabric, and you're going to be cutting that out and cutting around the cutaway or French dart. You're also going to want to mark the details of the dart onto the wrong side of your fabric. So if I turn this over, I will show you that I have already marked my dart in carbon paper. Hopefully you can see the black markings here. Now the carbon paper that I tend to use is by a brand called Saral. I think that's how you say it. And it comes either on a large roll or A4 sheets. And I use this on the wrong side to mark the wrong side of my fabric. I would, however, use white paper if I had white fabric because it can get a little bit messy. And I will use a tracing wheel to do this. Now, there are times when I don't use carbon paper. That would be if perhaps my fabric was very delicate and the tracing wheel might damage it, or perhaps it was going to be dry clean only, so this wasn't going to be able to wash out if it wasn't removed by the time I'd finished sewing my garment. So in those circumstances, I will do tailor's tacks and or thread tracing. With tailor's tacks with a dart like this, you would tack the end point, and that's really all you need to do. You can tack your starting points here, but that's going to be your seam allowance. So as long as you know what your seam allowance is, that's fine. Obviously, you're welcome to thread trace up both sides as well. Now, I'm not going to be showing you how I do that here, simply because I already have tutorials that show you how I do my thread tracing, how I do tailor's tacks, and how I use carbon paper. So I will link to those here. Now we're closer, hopefully you can see the black line that I marked with my carbon paper. I also like to mark a little sort of horizontal line across the top of the dart. I find that this is useful when people are learning to sew and learning to work with darts because it really gives you sort of an end point of where the dart needs to stop. However, again, when you're doing that, be cautious that the wheel and the colour and everything isn't going to be marking your fabric on the right side. So let's look at how we're going to pin this dart first. With a cutaway dart or with a French dart, you're always going to be sewing just like with a standard dart from the wide point or the opening where it hits the seam allowance up towards the point of the dart. So in order to pin this successfully, I generally start by pinching at the point. I will pinch that right on those lines, and then I will take a pin and position my pin in. Now, I pin along the line that I'm going to be stitching when it comes to darts. And if you've watched any of my other tutorials, you'll see that I pretty much always use this method. It's called pin basting. So I'm pinning along the line of sewing, or I would pin in the seam allowance so that my pin isn't going to be marking anything. I have had times in the past when I've used pins in different ways, horizontally, and I found that the point of the pin has marked the fabric. So that's why I use this method now. Anyway, the other thing I consider when I'm pinning my darts is how I'm going to be putting this through the sewing machine. I always like to pin so that as I'm sewing, the head of the pin is facing me and therefore it's easy for me to remove. So with this example, I'll be starting at this end here and I'll be sewing up to the point. The head of the pin is facing me, easy for me to pull out. The bulk of my fabric is on the left because obviously the smaller area of the machine is on this side. So always position the bulk of the fabric on the left. So let's continue with our pinning. So I'm going to be positioning, as we pinched that point to begin, And then all I'm doing is working my way down the dart. And when I am pinning, I am positioning my pin in on my line on this side, and I'm going to make sure it goes onto the line on the other side. If it doesn't, like there, I will remove the top layer, so my pin is still in the bottom side, and I will then position it so that the pin goes into the second side, and then I can pin that in place, just like so. And I will work my way down, or perhaps I would also start at the bottom. It doesn't really matter which way you work when you're pinning. I just always generally start with the point because I find that it's easier to sort of get that pinch, and then you can do perhaps the bottom and then work your way in between, or work your way down to the bottom. The key is always that the dotted lines have to be on top of one another, and you need to check that. Now, if you haven't marked the lines with thread tracing or with carbon paper, then instead you're simply going to have a tailor's tack at this point, and you might not have anything here. You might just have a seam allowance or perhaps a notch. So you would know the notch is where you're going to start sewing and the tailor's tack is where you're going to end. If you are a beginner, I do think that it's easier to have a drawn line on like this. So if you prefer the method of tailor's tacks, perhaps do your tailor's tacks and then take a ruler and a chalk pen and just draw a line that you're going to be sewing along. I just think it makes the whole process easier and more accurate when you're learning. Obviously, if you're more advanced, then by all means, you would be going through and aiming for that point. So I have now pinned that dart in place. My pins are on the line on both sides. I'm happy with that, and we can go to the sewing machine. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine. We're going to start sewing at the end of the dart here. So this was the wide part of the dart, or the edge of the fabric. We're going to sew along the line that we've drawn, removing the pins as we go. When we get to the end of the dart, we are going to simply sew off. We're going to then knot and tie our threads, trim them, feed them back through the stitching, whatever you want to do. Now you might find if you haven't got a horizontal line like I've got here for the end of my dart, that you want to draw one on. It can just be useful so that you really know where the dart must end. Use chalk or a removable pen. And this is the same stuff you could use if you only had tailor's tacks and you wanted to actually draw a stitching line on. You could here, however, also put a pin in horizontally, but again, as I said before, just beware that your fabric's suitable and that your pin isn't going to catch the fabric or anything. So join me at the sewing machine and I'll show you how we do this. So we're going to begin with a couple of forward stitches and a couple of backward stitches, just to secure the end of the dart. Now I'm going to be stitching along, and I'm aiming to stitch on the line that I have drawn. So I'm feeding that right into my needle. I'm going to be taking the pins out as I go. I don't want to upset my machine by leaving those in there. And I'm going to be sewing all the way to the ends. And if you're working with tricky fabric, the good thing that I like about pin basting like this is that I can sew and sort of take my pin out as I go. So it really allows me to take the pin out at the last minute. Now I'm working up to the point, the dart point, and what I'm going to do here is I need to sew off the fabric. So I'm going to be sewing off the fabric here, making sure that I leave the fabric by my horizontal mark. Ideally, the last 2 or 3 stitches should be on the edge of the fabric. That will get you a really professional finish and no sort of puckers. And there I've finished at the end. I'm not going to backstitch or cut my threads. I'm just going to lift my foot and pull that away. So I leave nice long tails for knotting. Now, as you can see, here is my sewn dart. The one thing I didn't add before you actually sewed this was that if you're working with a difficult fabric, you can by all means baste or tack your darts before sewing them. If that would help you, then please do it. Then obviously you'll need to remove your basting or tacking thread when you get to this stage. You're also going to need to trim the threads at the bottom. We backstitched here so they can be cut away, just like so. And then the threads at the point here. Now we didn't backstitch here. However, I personally often do backstitch my darts. The reason why I hardly ever teach it is because you need to be accurate when you're doing it, and you need to think about the fabric that you're doing it in. I wouldn't ever do it in a really lightweight fabric because it might cause a pucker there, and you always need to make sure that you do it very accurately. It needs to not add too much bulk, so it needs to be 1 or 2 stitches maximum, and it needs to be either on the exact line or just inside the line, so that you're, again, not changing the shape of the dart. But what I pretty much always teach is that you would knot your threads, because then you don't have anything to worry about. So I would separate these, and I would tie them once, push that all the way down, tie them twice. Don't pull your knots so tight that they actually pull up the threads. You don't want to sort of cause any puckers on your fabric. There we go. And then what you can do is either trim that off there if you're happy with that, or if you're worried about this coming undone, then you can by all means thread this through a needle and thread it back up the stitching or back up through the dart. I'll show you how to do that quickly now. Now, if I was worried about the dart, I've tied my knot, but if I didn't just want to cut away my threads, perhaps the dart was going to take a little bit of strain, it was in a very fitted garment, then I could thread the 2 threads through a needle, and I could just run this back up close to the stitching just a couple of times, just to hide it. And this just means that it's, even more secure than it would be otherwise. So just feed that up like so, and then I would just cut close to that, and it should stay in the fabric. So you're feeding it up just into the stitches or alongside the stitches. Obviously you don't want to be stitching into the garment here. But if you're happy to just knot it and cut it off, that is what I would do a lot of the time. This is my dart might be taking a lot of strain. What could I do to maximize its security? Now I've sewn my first dart, and on most garments you're going to have another dart that's symmetrical or that should be the same length and size on the opposite side of the body. So for this I'm going to be comparing my other dart on the other side before I sew it. The reason why I do this is because if my first dart was extended by 1 or 2 stitches or was perhaps short by 1 or 2 stitches, I might get away with it. And therefore what I would do is position my second dart on top, and I would take the length from the first dart onto my new dart, so that when I sew the second dart, I'm 100% sure that this is going to be the same length as the first one. Now we're going to look into pressing a French dart or a cutaway dart. Now, whenever you're pressing a dart, you're always going to want to have a ham or a curved surface to press the dart on. You could use a rolled up towel, because you want to make sure that when you press the point of the dart, that you can position that on the fullest part of the curve of the ham, and therefore you can get a nice smooth press and you won't get a pleat at the point. Now, depending on whether you have sewn a French dart or you've sewn a cutaway dart in another location, you need to consider how you want to press it, and there are a number of options. You could press it down with gravity, and that's generally what would happen with a lot of French darts. Because they're a horizontal dart, they will often go down with gravity, or that's generally the rule that's taught in dressmaking. However, you could also send them up. It will give you a slightly different look from the outside. Now, depending on where your cutaway dart is, you'll need to decide on which direction you press it if you want to press it as a full dart. The other option is to press it open. So I could press it open simply on the bit that's already cut away here, and then this section would be pressed flat. However, I could also cut this a little bit further if I wanted to, and then again press open and flat. It's really up to you. If you are unsure, I would recommend pressing it in a couple of different ways prior to cutting anything to see what you like the look of. Obviously, that might change how it sits on the side seam here, because obviously that depends on how you trued your original dart. You also want to think about how you're going to finish the dart. Is this garment going to have a lining so it doesn't matter? Or have you got 2 edges of fraying fabric here? In which case, you may want to run this through the serger or overlocker. You could simply run it through like so, and then you would obviously finish this end of the overlocker or serger by threading it back through the stitching. If you use that method, then you'll have overlocked them together, so you'll be pressing them in one direction, whichever you choose. Now for this demonstration, I'm going to be pressing this dart open. So I'm working my way along, pressing this open. And as I said, it's totally up to you, and it will depend on the fabric that you're working with and the pattern that you're working with and where the dart is. But if you're unsure, have a go, press them in one direction, press them open, and see how you get on. A key to pressing darts is that you need to press really on that point of the dart. You want to make sure that the bit of fabric around that, and use a little bit of steam, is nice and flat. And there you have the French dart pressed open. As I said, there are numerous options that you can use when it comes to a French dart or a cutaway dart. The other thing to consider is that you can actually sew a dart as standard and then cut away some of the volume like we have got here. This dart was cut away in the pattern cutting method, but if you do think that your darts are too large and there is a large amount of bulk or dart volume, then you can by all means cut them away and leave a nice finish. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you now feel confident sewing French darts or any form of cutaway darts in the future. Thanks for watching and see you soon.